read it? Perfect. Alright. Thanks for hanging out, guys. So the premise of what we're talking is to get you to think about everything differently. I will relate a lot of this to fitness and the body and stuff, but a lot of it is changing the way you're thinking. So we call it paradigm shifting, right? Your worldview is this way, our goal is to get it a little bit better. So, good quote from Atomic Habits. If you haven't read it or listened to it, I would highly recommend reading it or listening to it. Very easy book to read. But you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. It doesn't matter what aspirations you have, if you don't have a system in place to get to those aspirations, it makes your life a lot harder. So, thinking in systems. So we're going to go through what a system is, what it's made up of, how it works, which is the properties of the system, and then how to manage that system. So getting into get the results you actually want. As we'll go through, we'll see that systems are everywhere. They are much more complex and dynamic than you really think they are. But we'll start simple. So starting off with defining it. Defining a system, generally it's just a set of things that work together to create a network or to create a single output goal. You can have a system as simple as two gears turning together. That is technically a system, but it can be as complex as society. Society is technically a system. And we'll kind of go into how all of that kind of meshes together. So, thinking through a system lens. So, like I said earlier, our goal is to change how you see the world and how you think about it. Everyone's perspectives are different. A good quote that I always say, or my team always says, is your perspective is your reality. Right? So, Heather, your perspective is your reality, my perspective is my reality. Doesn't mean that they're wrong, it's just that they're different. Right? Everyone's going to approach it differently based on your experiences, your knowledge, the information you have currently, and the information you're continually getting in. So, each way of seeing allows our knowledge of the world to become a little bit more complete. So we're taking pieces of information and knowledge and starting to put together through our own experiences to create a different perspective. Like I said earlier, our goal is to create a paradigm shift. So the way you view the world getting into shift. So the old adage of you can't see the forest through the trees is exactly what we're going to do. Right? So if you think of a forest, the very base level is a leaf. Right? If you just look at the leaf, you're not going to see the trees, you're not going to see the forest. Right? You're not going to see anything. You start to look at the branches, you start to see the branches and the leaves. Right? Continuing with that. So you now see the whole tree, you see the whole forest, but if you take a step back, you see the whole landscape. Right? So a lot of people look at the leaf. I see this all the time in training, especially, is people look at the leaf, the goal, the pain, the injury, whatever it is. They look at that, and that's the only thing they look at, without taking in the other bigger pictures. Right? As we discussed before, it's an hour in the gym doesn't really matter because it's only 1 hour of 24. Right? I mean, percentage-wise, that's not very much. Take that across a week, a month, a year. The 1 hour they do with you almost nothing. So thinking about taking a step back and look at the macro. How to view systems, right? So a system is a relationship between structure and behavior, right? Problems can be solved by looking internally within the system rather than externally. Right? So if you look at this nice little gif of this cat, right? Just use this box, push this button, it opens up, the box and pushes it back up. The internal thing is what's causing that thing to be useless. It's not the external. Take the cat away, that thing stays closed. Nothing changes. As soon as you push the buttons, it opens up, it closes it back up. So you kind of have to figure out what's happening on the inside to fix the inside. So systems help to manage, adapt, and see the wide range of choices we have. It's a way of thinking that gives us freedom to identify root causes of the problems and see new opportunities. Right? So it's the opportunity versus the opportunity. So if you run into something that's stopping you from doing what you want or slowing you down, whether it's career change or you have a bad boss who's not letting you that as the obstacle that's limiting your progression. It's the opportunity to kind of reconfigure what you think about that thing, and how do you overcome it, how do you go around it, how do you break through that, right? So thinking through is a little bit different. Externally solving a problem, maybe blaming somebody else, right? Activating another option outside of the system to make that problem go away. These things usually don't fix the underlying issue, right? In fact, it usually separates it and creates further issues down the line. So it's that band-aid fix. So, system thinking lens allows us to reclaim our intuition about whole systems. It also helps hone our abilities to understand parts of the system. It helps you see interconnections. Makes you ask what-if questions about future behaviors. So if you're getting a behavior of X, you want it to be Y, it's going to ask you of what if this, what if that to get to different, right? And then it allows you to be creative, a little more courageous about what you're doing because you have a system in place that can carry out these things. So that's kind of like basics of what a system is, right? It has structure, parts of it, and it has behavior, how those things interact to create outputs. So going into how a system works, the basics of the system, again, it's an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. It has to include elements, which are usually the visible, tangible parts to a system. So if you think of a watch, it's the gears, right? As interconnections, right? Relationships that hold it together. So that might be the friction between the gears. It could be the grease, the lack of grease. It could be the battery, right? Depending on what you're using. These operate through a flow of information, right? That's kind of where we start to get into the human element of taking in new information, or even now computerized elements with AI. It gets information in and processes it and put something out. Information holds the system together. It determines how it operates. So the system is driven by information. The lack of information causes it to stop. And then it's function and purpose. Function and purpose is almost the most important part. What is the sole purpose of the system? You don't have a clear statement of what it's for. You're not going to have an understanding of what to put in, what to adjust, how to operate. That function and purpose is also usually the hardest thing to see, because usually it's some idea of something versus like I need X. It's like I need this kind of general area to be moved, not a specific. It's hardly usually seen. It's hard to see instantaneously as well. It's usually a delayed effect. We'll go into that in a little bit. If I'm going too fast, your questions, please stop. And then finally, it can be induced from behavior, not from rhetoric or stated goals. Right? So a lot of times people say, I want to do this. And that's their goal. So you create a system to that goal. The system isn't going to be perfect to that goal. It's going to be created from how it's interacting with the parts of the system. So a couple of pieces with basic systems, flows, right? Systems help control what is in the system. The flow in, right? You think of like a hose or a bathtub, like turn the faucet off or on, water comes out of the faucet, fills up the tub. All of that water is information. The tub itself is the system, and then the drain is the output, right? So you can control how much you come in or out. If you take a full plug of that drain, it's the same flow of water coming in versus going out. You're not really doing anything, kind of spinning wheels, but if your goal is to have a reservoir of water, you can plug the drain. You can limit how much water is coming out to kind of adjust what level of water you want. So at the end of the day, it's going to be what you do and not what you say. So if your goal is, I want to get stronger, but you don't lift weights, your system of fitness or exercise is not the system that's right for what your goal is. Right? The behavior of what you're doing is what's affecting that. So again, example, a pail of water with holes in it. Right? If your goal is to never have an overflowing pail, that's going to be determinant on how much water is going in and how many holes you have to get water out. Right? That's the simplest version of like a system. Right? Think of something a little bit more complex is take environmental policy, for example. If a politician says, I care about changing our environment for the better, but they don't enact any actual policy or do not give any funding for like India or whatever, their system of what they want versus what they're actually doing are two separate things. Right? Just because they say it doesn't mean it's actually happening. So, a bigger example, a little more complex, is if you take a car, for example. You take a car and you have different people say, build a car. But one person specializes in engines, someone else specializes in braking, someone else specializes in transmissions. Right? They're all going to have good cars, but very different cars. Right? So if we break that down, at the very basic, it's the frame of the chassis. Right? Line through the suspension. You have your engine. Now you have your drivetrain. Right? The chassis of the car to create a car. Right? These are technically two cars. One is built for performance. One is probably not a very functioning car. Right? But two very drastic outputs for the same. Right? That's how quickly things can change within the system. So more importantly, three factors that really affect systems. The most important variable in a complex system at any given time is the one that's most important. Right? That's the bottleneck of things. If your goal is to have a 300-pound squat, but you have no ability to brace and control the intra-abdominal pressure, can you get to that 300-pound squat? Maybe. Are there going to be consequences to not having intra-abdominal pressure? Probably really high likelihood. Right? So fixing those things first opens up that bottleneck. Allows for more information to come. Allows more time for you to adjust. The second thing is the most important variable to change. Well, excuse me. The most important variable will change over time. So as you're getting more information, your system will adapt to that new information. It is never going to stay the same. These are complex systems, right? Not as simple as the watch with the gears turning. Because that's an enclosed, simple system. As we get into, again, the human element of things, thinking about other things, contexts, perspectives, it starts to add complexity. We can see this with this example here with flowers, right? So at one point, flower will need sunlight as the most important thing until that soil dries out, right? And then you need to add water, right? So the need for the flower changes based off of its environment and what's happening. And the third thing is, none of these variables function in isolation. There's never one or the other. Everything is always influencing each other. So again, going back to an example of a gear. If we take gears, for example, thinking it a little more simplistically. A single gear spins, nothing happens. You can have two or three. Now you have three pieces moving together. You have multiple. Eventually you're going to have more complex building and timing and all these things to create a watch. Something as simple as a gear, you turn into a watch by adding pieces, adding complexity to it. System outcomes. So there's a few things we're going to go over with system outcomes. First one is going from certainty to probability, bounded rationality, satisficing, effects and side effects. And within that, changing the scripts and seeing the side effect to the desired effect. We'll break all these four pieces down. Before I go on though with system outcomes, any questions on kind of the basic principles of systems? Kind of move through that a little faster. Make sense? All right, going from certainty to probability. Right? If we think in systems, nothing is ever going to be absolutely certain. And that's just true with life anyways, right? There's nothing that's guaranteed in life except for one thing, that's death. But at best, with anything, we can make informed guesses based on relative probability. What that system is more or less likely to do, right? So we can have a general idea of our practice and our system based on the inputs. We can probably guess which direction it's going to head. Very rarely will we get down the bullseye, right? But we'll get close to it. That's kind of the goal, nudging in the right direction. So within that, taking isolated episodes tells us nothing about the long-term effects. Right? If we think of the stock market, for example, a single day might have a dip of 5%. That means nothing in the long term if the long-term projection is trending upwards. Trends over time matter more than the short-term fluctuations. But as the system evolves, it must learn what is happening, how it is happening, and most importantly, why it's happening. Once we understand these, we are able to then learn how to influence that system. So once we understand why something is happening, we can then make changes to adjust it to the direction we want. We have to understand that we will never have full control of the system. The system is always, it's almost its own living being once it's going. We'll kind of go into some of the fallacies of that. But not all factors are always measurable or accessible. So, but at the same time, just because you don't have access or you can't control it, a lot of times it doesn't matter. Think of something in the gym, right? If you don't have control of sleep, for example, we don't get 8 hours of sleep, we got 6. Does that really matter? You can still, work out the high intensity you're looking for? No. Right? So, going from it has to be this way to we just need to go step in the right direction is kind of how we want to start talking about things. The second thing we're talking about is bounded rationality. So bounded rationality is essentially your perspective. If we take a look at this picture, so for this adequate cover of fail, or adequate cover fail. The guys next to the car have adequate cover, right? In their heads, they're safe. What they haven't thought about was that guy at the very end, which is clearly not, right? So from your perspective, you're going to make a very rational and reasonable decision if you don't think about the context and perspective of others. Right? As soon as you take, I need to make sure my whole team has cover, not just me, you will quickly find that this car is not a good piece of cover, especially if you're more, right? So, actions that make sense to one can echo and affect others and other systems outside of your awareness. So that's kind of where you take your perspective and having to think outward towards other people, right? Chris, just because you washed or did the laundry before you left today, maybe you didn't finish it, you forgot to tell Nelly, right? And there's a whole disconnect of like where all the towels, where everything's at, right? So thinking about how your decisions and actions can affect other people's decisions and other systems going on at the same time. So some points on bounded rationality that help us understand this is we rarely have all the meaning. Right? We're usually in a hurry. We often focus too closely on that single episode or the recent events, so like recency bias. We focus more on information that confirms our current worldview while disregarding or discrediting what opposes it, right? So we call that confirmation bias. You only want to hear things you want to hear. We'll go into it a little bit, but not challenging these beliefs and thoughts leaves you in the same circle, right? You're kind of just spinning your tires. Actions in complex systems have side effects in and on those systems. Decisions that only make sense locally can still have impacts globally. Right? And we'll kind of go into this in the next slide, but the blind man and the elephant. Has anyone heard this parable? So the blind man and the elephant is an old parable. Essentially, a king wanted to show this elephant to his cabinet. Now it's full of people who are blind. Everyone rushed to see this elephant, wanting to feel it because that's how they see the world. And they all feel, touch different parts, right? Person grabs the tail, thin, ropey, feeling really rough. In his head, oh, it's a rope. Right? Guy on the side, belly, really rough, long, flat, thinks it's a wall. Guy grabs a leg, tall, round, thinks it's a tree trunk. Guy grabs a horn, tusk, thinks it's a spear. Guy grabs a ear, thinks it's a rug. Guy grabs a trunk, thinks it's a snake. Right? Each are technically correct in their own perspective, because that's the only thing that they have to go on. That's the only piece of information they understand about it. Right? So their perspective is still true, but it's not true in relation. Right? Because they don't have all of it. Again, you'll never fully understand the experience of others. Decisions you make based on the information available to you, in combination with your past experiences, your needs, your goals, will always be different from others. Right? Again, most people make rational, reasonable decisions for themselves without taking into consideration others and understanding how that affects other systems, other people, and others' interactions. Another example of this is if you take commercial fishermen. Right? Their job is not to understand how many fish are in the sea. Right? Their only goal in their head is to make money by catching fish. They're not even going to take into consideration how many fish their competitors are catching. Because their only goal, their system, is to catch as many fish as possible. Right? That's the role of governing systems like game and fish, to set regulations on, hey, you only have X amount of pounds or X amount of fish a day or whatever. Fishermen, they're not thinking about it. Questions on boundary vessels? Yes.
I guess is there ever a time when you don't want to think in systems and you do want to have that narrow view? Is it like an on-off switch, or is it like you should aspire to always think in systems?
You should almost always aspire to systems. There's very few things in the world that are not going to be affected by systems. If you flip it on the light, turning on or off a light can have a much larger impact down the road. So, say you forget to turn the light off today, not a big deal. But you forget that for a month, what happens? Energy bill goes up, right? Costs go up. If we're really hurting, right? With stable power grids, right? It can cause more brownouts, more blackouts, right? More burning of other fuels to get the electricity. So, like, the one decision that you make today does not necessarily mean it's not going to affect the power. So the second concept we'll go through is satisficing. So satisficing is a combination of words. Skip that for now. But essentially, it's when you start to say that's good enough. It's the good enough fallacy, right? These decisions can quickly be made rather than that's the better decision or that's the perfect decision. Without real world constraints, a lot of times these decisions are made without having enough time, money, information, or other resources that you need. So it's a combination of satisfy and suffice. Right? It's enough to satisfy and it's enough to suffice the decision to be made. Again, it goes back to the tendency of someone saying, that's good enough. Usually that good enough is a step below the standard you want. It's like, it's almost there, it's 90% there, but you're like, that's fine, it's good enough. Right? A lot of decision makers satisfies by simplifying the world around them. Right? They take a complex system and try and simplify it. Very rarely does that work out very well. They try to do it by being practical. So if we take this concept of satisficing, right? It's a slippery slope, because once you start, it starts to become practice. So, that's good enough, that's good enough. Next thing you know, you're 10 feet down the hill versus right? And this leads to a fallacy called drifting into failure, right? Driven by the good enough decisions. Because when we make these satisficing decisions, we do not take all factors into consideration. We can simplify our worldview, and then we mismatch expectations with reality. So this mismatch of expectations versus reality, we think of the world as being perfect and good. It's usually because you're in your own bubble. Once you step out, you start to realize how many other issues are going on. So go from satisficing to all effects and side effects. So we often think of the main effect of the goal of what we want as being the only effect we have. We often overlook side effects when we get that option. So we might, for example, if our goal is to make as much money as possible, you might make much money. But the side effect might be you don't have any relationships, you're angry, you hate your job, you hate the world, you're pissed off. Or you work so long you don't have time to. Right? Those are all side effects to make. So thinking about when you're going towards that one direction, what are the implications of heading that direction? What are the other side effects that you can see when you go into that? So it's one of those things where you can't really see it until you see it, right? So if you take this picture, for example, this girl holding popcorn, kind of looks like she got some chicken legs, but in reality, what she didn't see was actually more popcorn. Right? Once you see it, you kind of see it. No. That's a bag of popcorn.
Oh, I actually could not see. I was like, yeah, it looks like grass.
But see, that's the thing, right? So like you might get the thing without seeing that.
Yeah, I can
popcorn.
only see her chicken legs.
Okay. Exactly. So, kind of shifting that mindset, right? There's no such thing as a side effect. A side effect is a narrative you're going to tell yourself. It's a story you tell yourself because that's not what you wanted. It's like, oh, that just happened because of this. No, it still happened. You're just making yourself feel good saying it's a side effect. Right? Yeah, just because it's not intended doesn't mean that we can't ignore them. You still have to understand what those side effects are doing, because that's still going to influence how you operate within the system. So sometimes our interventions intended to solve one problem end up creating another problem down the road, whether you want to or not. Again, it's going back into the story, the narrative you want to tell yourself. Complex and adaptive systems are like a game of pool, where the pool balls are always in motion, right? You can redirect them, but you can never stop them moving and interacting, right? So it's almost always impossible to know where to hit a ball, where it's going to head, because they're constantly moving, right? So if you were to play pool in space, right, you hit one ball, they're just going to continually move back and forth because there's no friction to gravity, just to slow them down, right? So hitting one ball will affect that one ball, but then it's going to continue to move and hit more and off the wall. It's almost impossible because there's so much information moving around at the same time. So, in a complex system, a single input with full control will fully control nothing, but partially influence everything. So within the system, right? Now we know that there's no such thing as a side effect, unless you want to tell yourself that you're so happy. There's order of effects, right? Primary effect is a direct result of an action, right? Like the cue ball hitting that front point ball. The second order effect is the result of that action leading to another result. So if you get the one ball into the two ball, one ball hitting two balls is the second order, right? It goes down further, right? The chain reaction continues. If you think of them as side effects or happy accidents, right? Just because they weren't intended doesn't mean they didn't exist. They still existed, right? So taking those into account. If you think of this in a bigger setting, fixing these external effects almost solves nothing. And we see this all the time with policy. Right? Just because someone doesn't like the roadblock, they take it away. That's what happens. Flow of traffic happens, right? All these other things get affected because they take away the roadblock, right? But the goal is to shut down the street or open the street back up, not tell anybody, right? There's all these things coming into each other. A lot of times too, that first order, that primary effect, can fix a second order effect, but then it can also become another different problem that you need to solve. Right? So that's again going back to that band-aid, the band-aid fix, which actually fixing it just kicks the can down the road. How you approach this and how you change it is the narrative again, tell yourself. You can take it, all of the effects you're creating, and understand how all of them are being created. You can then influence to minimize all of those effects to the direction you want to go. So going back into the interactions and feedback loops, right? The stimulus response cycle. So a good example is a thermostat. Right? Thermostat's going to read the temperature of the room. It's going to understand where you want that room temperature to be, and how to adjust for that. Right? So if it's too cold, right, and you want it set to 68 degrees, but it gets to 67, that thermostat will read that, put the heater on, get it back to 68. It travels up above that to 69, 70, right, it turns off, and waits for it to cool back down. Right, so in simplistic form, a stimulus response cycle is something happens, the stimulus sends information to something else, and something else produces the response. Right, this something happens, might be, it gets warmer, more people are in here working outside. Right, temperature of the room rises, the thermostat reads that, it sends a response, kicks on the AC, cools the air down. Right, that cycle just continues. So negative feedback loop is exactly that. It is that thermostat. It's just this constant cycle of information, action, response. It's just constantly reading. It tells us what to do, what to stop doing, do less of, or do differently. Right? Negative feedback can be found in the gap between what we know and what we actually do. Right? It is often achieved at a price. We usually achieve negative feedback through failure. Oh, I did that wrong. I got in trouble. I got reprimanded. So when you do understand this, it's understand that failure, that valuable information you learn from that, it's that obstacle versus opportunity. If you failed at something, doesn't mean that it was wrong, because now you use that information for further decisions down the road. A big piece with feedback loops and its efficiency is resilience. Right? So resilient systems have multiple feedback loops usually operating at different times and different places, in different ways within the system to maintain balance. Right? Again, feedback is rarely immediate. Usually you see feedback a week, a month, a year, 2 years down the road. Right? From there you have to then, by then usually it's too late to fix that thing. You then have to go back and redirect. A good example of that is if you're overzealous in the weight room, right? You might feel good today, tomorrow, by lifting 300 pounds in your back squat. But if you continue to push to that level with, improper intra-abdominal pressure or improper mechanics, that small little change in your joint angle might compound 6 months down the road to significant back pain. Significant pain, wherever it might be. We're going to kind of blow through OODA loops. Has anyone heard of an OODA loop? way to break it down. Good thing to think about all loops in general, but especially with loops, it's never ending cycle. Like, we kind of go through this through our internship, but understanding that any process or any system is really a never ending cycle. It's a constant moving, almost living thing. So OODA loop stands for observe. So you're gathering data. To orient, understand what that data means, and do about it. Decide, take the action of what to do next based off of the first two, and then act. Do the thing. Right? A lot of times people get to here, maybe here. A lot of people fail to do this. Right? Of the OODA loop system, the orientation is the most important. Understanding where you are and what to do about it. We understand the what, the significance of what has happened, and how our situation relates to or is affected by that. Right? Understanding the significance of what has happened is influenced by our culture, heritage, prior experiences, our own analysis and synthesis. This is our perception. Right? This is how we view the world. This is how we take information. This is how we understand things. Feedback loops understand what is driving our decision cycles, right? Our perception and our experiences. We can have a more conscious control of our responses and our habitual ways of thinking if we go through these loops, understanding the information, what to do about it, to do it, and to actually execute. Right? We also then have a greater ability to assess, change, and improve our actions and thoughts to help ourselves to meet our goals. Right? So if you think of GPS tracker mapping your location where you're going, monitoring every turn, okay, went this way, now what? Which way do I go? Without the use of GPS on our phone, Google Maps, how we do it before, right? You're constantly looking at the map, looking where you are, reorienting yourself, gathering more information, understanding where you need to go next and actually where you need to go. Questions on feedback loops? All good? Perfect. So going into dealing with complexity well. We know what it is, we know what the system does, is how to understand what to do about it. Right? So you can't direct the system. You can only influence it or nudge it in a certain direction. For example, a strength program. A strength program doesn't actually make someone stronger, right? It only provides inputs that influence some of those actions, right? So that might mean telling someone to do exercise A, exercise B, this many sets, this many reps, right? These actions then produce the response, right? The person actually doing the thing is what gets the response. Now, hopefully, giving enough of the right inputs to create the right output, right? So if you stop thinking of, especially exercise, block A, block B, block C, hypertrophy, strength, power, conditioning. Realistically, you're doing a little bit of everything all at once, all the time. So if you think of gradients versus black and white, or shades of gray, separated, you tend to let go of a lot of the small things. It doesn't mean that small things aren't important. They just don't mean everything. So, dealing with complexity well, find the limiting factor for performance rates. What are the things holding that person back, think back the most? Because all sometimes you can do is just get them to let go of it. That can mean literally drinking more water, not eating fast food every day. Easy. Not all parts of the system are created equal. Some parts will limit processes or adaptations more than others. Right? Again, going back to the feedback, or the bottlenecks, and then these change over time, right? Just because you fix one thing, other limiting factors come in, right? Other brakes can push. How many brakes can you lift versus pushing the gas pedal harder, which is what most people don't need. A lot of times it's taking things away. Right? help you. So when you're looking at things for effective change, effective leverage points that do little are usually things like constraints, parameters, numbers, sets of reps. Usually don't mean anything in the long run. Instead, look at the principles that guide the system, the goal of the system, and the philosophy behind it. So again, thinking of the grayscale, the gradients of thinking of like, okay, you need to do 10 reps to get hypertrophy. So what if they do 8? Still get a little bit of hypertrophy. Right? Not as much, but still getting there. Right? So thinking of it less of has to be one way or the other. We need to head that general direction. Moving on to accepting constant change. And equilibrium is death. So doing nothing is usually never a viable survival strategy. Sitting around waiting for something to happen usually never works out. Right? Requisite variety helps with being able to take on difficult tasks at any point in time. So it's like, oh, I want to be able to run a 5K tomorrow. But you never ran in your life and you only lived at heavy weights. Could you? Probably. You're probably going to break. Right? So being able to do a little bit of everything at any time point in time is a much better strategy for the long run. Right? Think of this as like metabolic flexibility. Right? You see this all the time with diet and nutrition. I only eat paleo. What happens if you have carb? Or vegetarian, for example. You go vegetarian for 5 years, and all of a sudden eat a hamburger, usually you're going to see some bad side. You're going to reap the consequences of only eating one way versus like, oh, I usually eat a little bit of everything pretty balanced. You can get away with a lot more whenever you want versus being so strict. Just like that silver. One thing with complex system is avoid forced equilibrium. Right? This is artificially imposed stability. Right? This happens when we center ourselves within our comfort zone and we don't want to hit the right? Again, avoiding movement or avoiding stasis doesn't protect you. Right? It only hinders you in the long run. So if we think about resilience again, think of resilience as a plateau. Your plateau surface is your resilience. If you stay in the center of that plateau actually starts to crumble inward towards that center. Right? The less resilient that system is, the smaller the plateau. Eventually, you're going to be on the next stage. Any shift or change in any decision or action or input can throw you off the edge. Right? So your goal is to be a resilient person or just build a resilient system is to build as big of a plateau as possible. Usually that's set with guardrails, habit changing, right? Lifestyle changing.
Like
Condition, right?
Yeah.
Right? Getting to the edge of your comfort zone as well.
Yeah.
Right? So it can be simple as not having junk food in your house.
Or cold plunging.
Or cold plunging, right? Doing the hard thing usually expands your resilience. Right? So, moving on. So, measuring and optimizing the right things. So, again, if we're looking at a system, we're not looking at the right pieces. So you're going to head in a vastly different direction than you expected. Right? What's the goal? So that should always be keep the goal going. Always think about what's the purpose, why am I doing this? Stay on that track. That way you can always start to improve the most important things to keep you on that goal. Right? If we bring it back to fitness, right, you can go, if your goal is to lift heavy today in a back squat, you can lift 350 pounds on a back squat with shit form, pound 400 milligrams of caffeine, blast music in your ears to get you pumped up. Could you do the 350 pound back squat? Yeah. Will you hurt tomorrow? Probably. Or you can pull back a little bit, go 300 pounds with, near perfect form, making you feel and look easy. much better long-term strategy. So, kind of getting a little more complex by adding in subsystems to our systems, but if we start to let the subsystem control the thing, it will actually take over the primary effect that we're doing. Right? So again, if we look too closely, we see this all the time with lifting and tracking weights and times and numbers. You begin to hyper-focus on that number rather than the actual goal. If your goal is to feel better and be stronger, does the 350-pound back squat really matter? Are you still lifting heavier than day one? Probably, I would hope so. But that's the bigger difference. Right? So, we see this all the time in fitness with what are you really trying to do, especially in group fitness, right? So a lot of times people look for excessive soreness, right? Having fun versus being more strategic, right? Or just getting slick. Right? People have this fallacy all the time. And those people are the ones focusing on subsistence. They focus so much on having fun, but 6 months down the road they can tell you why their body composition hasn't actually changed. Right? So we understand how to deal with it well, how to deal with it in a bad way. This is more of what happens if we don't take control or don't take care of the small things, right? So some systems have to go through real quick is seeking the wrong goal, shifting the burden to the intervener, and drifting into failure. A lot of times we're unaware of these traps until it's too late to do anything about it. Usually that's when we're picking up the pieces to understand why it's happening. So, seeking the wrong goal. What truly matters is not usually what's most easily measured. Again, if your goal is to be stronger, it means nothing of how much weight you're lifting today. Right? Usually it's like, oh, I want to feel better. There's almost no way to quantify feeling, right? We tend to focus and get good at the things that don't actually matter. Again, reps, how much weight we're lifting, how many passes we can move, right? Those things almost never matter. Shifting the burden to the intervener. We see this all the time with like aids, like sleep aids, for example. People who can't sleep tend to gravitate towards sleep aids. It occurs when a solution to a problem reduces your autonomy, makes you depend on outside solutions to avoid stepping backwards. You're adding crutches and band-aids everywhere to get you to your goal. Right? So if your goal is to sleep, you can't sleep, so you take some melatonin. Take it over time, it stops working less, you take more. Eventually melatonin stops working. What do? You go to your doctor, you prescribe it. Issue at hand of you not falling asleep is still there. It's just being masked by all these other this dependency on aids takes over the system. Right? As soon as you take that aid away, everything burns. Right. So the third one is drifting into failure. This is kind of the biggest one we see most often. You see this all the time with what we call comfort creep. Yeah.
Are you changing slides?
Yep. Sweet. I blame the TV.
Yes.
Try to stop. Stop. All right. Drifting to failure. So we see this all the time with comfort creep, right? You get better at doing the thing you're doing. never push outside your boundaries. You want to just sit there. You're going to get better at sitting there. Eventually, you don't want to do anything. You don't want to do that, right? You often see this with statements made like, it could be worse, right? Or, again, good enough. It's a errant feedback loop that goes from comparing performance to an established standard. Again, getting to about 90% of that standard until you're eventually working your way down. Now the standard's here. Again, it's something we don't often see until it's too late. And then you're kind of often questioning why it wasn't overlooked. It's always because it looks normal. Never really see the change, right? But again, it goes back to the system, right? It's not the parts that matter, it's how it was behaving, how the things were interacting. Because you said no, because you did something just slightly below your standard, the system started to fail. Right? So drifting and failure is influenced by 5 concepts. Sensitivity to initial conditions, decrementalism, scarcity and competition, and unruly technology. And contribution of the protective structure. Right? So remember, we can never fully control a system, only disturb it. Hopefully in that direction we want it to be. You can see this all the time by giving someone an inch and you take them out. Right? Because you tolerated them taking advantage of this one small thing, they then take advantage of more and more and more. Right? You often see this with the chaos theory and the butterfly effect. Right? Where the butterfly is flopping times over here, exponentially make an effect halfway around the world. Right? So decrementalism, we see this in both sides, right? So again, going back to atomic habits, right? You can get 1% better every day, or 1% worse every day. Both will project you in a very opposite direction of where you want to be. Right? That downward shifting standards of quality happens so slowly that it's never really noticed or addressed. It's the regressive normalization of deviance from that standard reality. So moving on to scarcity and competition, right? So environment under increasing pressure creates an environment of cutting corners and decrementalism. So again, going back to step below your standard. Cutting corners, or this hack, or this shortcut you're looking for, usually have pretty drastic impacts down the road. Taking that now to save a little bit of time will cause you to spend large amounts of time down the road. Right? Fourth one, unruly tech. So we see this all the time with our tech that we wear, right? Garmin, Fitbit, Whoop, Aura, all those things, right? What they actually do is they usually don't work in the way that they're intended to. They're usually very reliable on what they're measuring, not very valid. They are actually very bad at reading heart rate, HRV, and all that stuff. But they're always wrong the same amount of wrongness. So if it's reading your resting heart rate at 53 beats per minute, it could be 4 or 5 beats off, but it's always going to be 4 or 5 beats off. So it's a very reliable thing of what it's measuring, it's just not measuring accurately. So think of these as like ongoing experiments. Use this as a piece of information, not the end all be all. Just because Dan says, oh, you're at 10% today, but you feel great. Your own intuition is usually a better calculation. The third one is, or the last one is contribution of the protective structure. We see this, we saw this with like safety equipment football, right? They started off with no helmets, leather helmets, now we have all this protective gear. All that protective gear, all that happened was people were able to hit each other harder and harder and harder. Right? We're kind of seeing those effects too. Trying to protect the thing, but in reality, we're adding more damage to the same time. So, finally, changing how you think. Changing thinking habits. A big word that will get tossed around when you start to think, you start to understand and learn about some of the philosophical and sociological things going on in the world, is epistemology. Epistemology is essentially a process of understanding knowledge, and how you got to that knowledge, and how you're influenced by that knowledge, and how you influence your understanding of knowledge. Right? So changing thinking habits, thinking of individual to the whole, structure to the process, going from objective science to epistemic science, building networks, building synapses. So that's the metaphor of knowledge. And then truth to approximate. Reductionism to complexity. Right, so going from individual parts to the whole. So if you take your quad, for example, you can't really explain what a quad is or what it does without understanding what the knee is, what your joint is, what your bones are, right? The other muscles surrounding that quad, right? You can never really get a full picture of what it does and functions, right? You have to understand a bigger picture, right? Going from structure to process, right? Process comes first, structures will come around that process. Right, so that's kind of, if you go back to, for some of you will understand with how we program or how I systemize programming, the process of step by step, then puts the pieces together around that step. Right? The body doesn't move the way it does because of how it was shaped. It is shaped because of how it was needed to move. We evolved to how we are moving today. And we're kind of seeing another evolution of even moving backwards a little bit by sitting so much. Right? We went from a crawling to a bent over to an upright posture. We're kind of moving back downward as we get more seated, and everything's coming back down towards the ground. Shifting from objective to epistemic science. So originally, the thought process of how knowledge was created was you do an experiment and it's completely isolated from your own influence. Right? If you think of like a perfect clean lab, nothing else influences what happens inside. In reality, that's very rarely true. Right? As soon as you run experiments on how to improve vertical jump, right? Everything from you watching to maybe there's 2 or 3 other participants in the study watching you at the same time, all of those influence performance, regardless of what methodology you use, what you use, all that stuff. Everything's always being influenced. Right? We'll never get an objective picture of what someone's really doing. So think of this to training, right? So if you're training your client, you saw a new movement, you wanted to try it out on your client. But then someone you highly respect, maybe your boss, comes in to watch you, and all of a sudden you don't feel so confident doing that. That's already influencing your decision to do that, right? So understanding how nothing is always fully objective. It's always influenced by other outputs. From buildings to networks, so knowledge. Think of knowledge less as structured things, especially with like research. Think of it more of a network or a toolbox. Right? Everything you learn is another tool you can use. Right? Just because you have a screwdriver, but you have a nail, could you use that screwdriver to hammer that nail into a wall? Probably may work. Is there a better tool for that? Yeah. Right? So think of knowledge as like a giant toolbox. The more tools you have, the more options you have. Right? Going from truth to approximate descriptions. Right? Again, scientific knowledge can very rarely achieve absolute certainty. Everything it's generally this way. Especially if you start reading research articles, very rarely will they say, this will do this. It is, our research showed that it has influenced this, but we need to take into consideration X, Y, Z. Here's our fallacies of what we did. Here's other things that we need to improve upon. Here's what other researchers should do to make this better. Right? It's no longer, you know, you lift 10% of your body weight on body weight squatting, you will get 20% stronger. It's never happened. Right? And going from reductionism to complexity. So a lot of times people like to reduce how complex things are, right? They always look for that one factor to explain other factors of their failures, right? Well, I haven't lost weight because I've been eating too many carbs. Is it the carbs, or is it the lack of movement? Is it the type of carb you're eating, the timing of your eating, right? All of these things. So think of it less of the one thing, again, broader picture. Right? So changing how you think to requisite writing, again, getting to the edge of that plateau, getting to the edge of the comfort zone, pushing the boundaries, having more tools in your toolbox. It gives you more perspectives and views of how to approach the problem. Right? Just because I approach the problem one way doesn't mean you're going to approach it the same way. You're going to approach it a very different way, but if we work together, you have your way and I have my way, we're able to compromise to something that's even better than both of ours. Solutions. Right. Use constraints. Constraint system becomes a predictable one. A predictable system can be exploited. Right. As soon as you can predict what's going to happen, you can also find how to break that system. Right. So, using as many tools as you can. Going into organizational isomorphism. So this is things that start to look like the same thing. You see this all the time with fitness programming. I see it all the time in my own programming. You forget about a few exercises, you start going into clients, next thing you know, all of your clients do that. Right? All of your programs start to look the same. It doesn't mean that it's wrong, but you have to understand the implications of it. Is this the best thing for this context, for this person right now? Right? So understand where that's coming from. Usually, though, it means things are getting worse. Okay, an example we're given in this book I was reading to is, we see this with our coffee shops. All coffee shops essentially look the same. Line, there's a bar, a cashier, a barista, and then there's seats. Usually it's like a modern look and feel to it. It's either very brightly lit or very dimly lit. Usually some greenery. Right? All look the same. Quality of the coffee, usually somewhere in the middle. Very rarely do you see these spikes of like, oh, there's all these good coffee shops everywhere. It's usually like, oh, most of them are like Starbucks. So, diversity of thought. Identify the core principles of what you're thinking. Right? If you identify these principles of the fields and everything that's influencing your system, you will find yourself going through this thought process through these stages, which is simplicity. Oh, I get that. Pretty straightforward. You have to learn a little bit more. Like, I need to learn about X, Y, Z on top of A, B, C, and G, and W. And then it goes to elegance, like, oh, realistically, G, D, A, B, Y don't matter. X, Z, and E that really matter. I'm going to focus on those three things because that's going to make the most impact. We see this all the time with as your growth as a person or as a coach especially, you start to learn about all the things that influence training. What happens with weights doesn't really matter. Right? Like I said at the beginning, the sets, the reps, doesn't really matter. If you can change the lifestyle and habitual changes outside of the gym, this will make a more big effect, and then also that stuff's the actual stuff that's going to change. This is just helping them. Right? So think of it less as fitness, but like a lifestyle change. Lifestyle changes are a lot harder to change, a lot harder to measure, a lot harder to see. But if you can approach your goal as a coach or trainer to be, I need to change lifestyle habits, not movement habits, you will see a much bigger push of client success. I can almost guarantee it. As long as they're doing the thing, right? That's getting the lifestyle changes, getting them to do the thing. Again, so getting to keeping the goal and understanding the purpose of what you're doing and have everything influence that direction. Right? Versus taking the scattered, oh, we're gonna look this today. Oh, I haven't asked you in a couple weeks, how'd you sleep? Or how's your nutrition? Right? You're taking these pieces separately and all these systems are working not coherently separate. So you're not really changing anything. You're changing this a little bit, you're trying to fill 10 buckets at once versus trying to fill one bucket at a time. That's going to feed the next bucket, to the next bucket, right? So you can create this system of perpetual motion once you do. Any questions? That was a lot of information. Just over now. No question. That's right. All I've heard. Yeah.
I guess that was a good summarization of the whole thing. Is basically we're taking like a client and we're on an individual level, we're kind of working on the leaf level, but we need to think about their whole 23 hours in a day as the forest.
A good example, you see this all the time with PT. I come in with back pain, focus everything on back pain. That clears up a little bit, oh, my knee hurts now. Right? Or they leave because it stops hurting. Okay, keep doing your homework. No symptoms, so I'm not gonna do my homework. Come back 6 months later, oh, my back's hurting again. Right? They didn't actually change the output. Right? They changed the subsystem to subside the symptoms, but the underlying issue is still there. Right? They're not changing movement pattern, gait patterns, lifestyle changes, right? Because that back pain could literally just be how they're sitting every day as a desk. Right? It doesn't matter how much you change in the body if they continually do the same thing outside of the thing you're trying to fix, right? Any other questions?
I think something I've been working on with my clients, I think this is what you're getting at. We have our outcome-based goals, and I've been telling them to choose one or two things that they can change outside.
Yep.
Like just focus on one, maybe two things consistently, and then we can pick a new thing in a couple months.
Yeah. So that's
See if they get a little bit closer to their outcome.
exactly. So that's taking the performance breaks off of it, right?
Yeah.
So if it's, oh, I want you to get an extra hour of sleep next month. So then you don't come in as tired, exhausted when you're lifting weights or working out. So you have more motivation to do the thing you're supposed to be doing by changing one little thing. Dr. Galvin and Dan Garner, they're biomolecular athletes. That's what they call it. All they do with their high-level performers is get rid of the breaks. Because realistically, all the training you're going to do at that pinnacle level of, UFC champions, boxing champions, NFL players, you're going to get margins of change because they're such good athletes, right? They're so well trained. So rather than looking at pushing harder to get that 0.5% change, let's change your diet. Let's change your sleep habits. Oh, we have an imbalance in hormones. Let's fix that. Right? These easy things that can make drastic changes with performance without having to do more. Right? It's actually doing less. Right? But yeah, it's exactly that. It's what things can you do outside of here, or how do you change your mindset and how you approach things can have a much longer effect. Any questions? This is kind of a crash course in systems, but if you start, the bigger takeaway is, again, taking a step back and looking at the big things. And making sure the goal is the goal. The goal always has to be the goal. Is it actually the decision you're making today about this helping us get to the goal? If it's a I don't know, or maybe, especially a no, it's like, is there a better option? Right? And it goes back to the internship. Is there a better, easier, safer choice of exercise than what you're doing to get you the same output? If the answer is yes, then you have to ask yourself, why aren't we doing that? Right? You don't have a reason. Maybe you should do that. Right? Reasons can be as simple as you just want something new and novel. Going back to the subsystem of fun and fitness. Getting people to understand that real fitness isn't really fun. It's actually very boring. Right? It's walking more, it's doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over with the adaptation. Right? If you're doing something different every day, you're not going to win. Anything else? put this in here, but if you're want to geek out on systems, a book called Thinking in Systems by Ella something. Thinking in Systems is the book. Pretty easy, read or listen. Then there's Atomic Habits, has some good stuff on systems. If you want a manual on training systems, Building the Elite is a good one.